I'm going to let you do most of the talking.
News Radio 1020 KDKA.
All right, so much to talk about with this guy. We're just going to get right to it. From impacts, self-defense, self-preservation, a former Marine, works with CSI investigators. He is Sam Rosenberg, no stranger to our audience. He is here this morning, national security, and also a whole lot more. Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Rob. How are you?
You've been a very busy man, obviously, since the tragedy at Sandy Hook. You've been traveling all over the country, haven't you?
Absolutely.
So what have you been doing besides talking to schools? And obviously, you got to be scratching your head, because I can just say this from what I've heard from people like Bob Minard and Louie and others, just locally. You can't be very pleased. John Hudson and I have talked about this too with school security. A lot of people continue to drop the ball.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think we're making some progress. You know, there's definitely a mentality shift that we're seeing here, and I think that's really positive. But no question about it, you know, we're still head in the sand to a certain degree, and that seems to be the mentality, you know, in this country that, you know, we have a tragedy like this, and then we really don't want to uncrack the code of what we're dealing with. We just want to take a few Band-Aid measures. But, you know, to the degree that, you know, a lot of educators and principals and administrators are really pushing to see more training and see some really solid movement going, I think from a grassroots level, you know, we're going to see some traction here.
Let's talk about Israel briefly. Why is it, even though they've had people that have tried to hurt them, they seem to be the ones always who get the first step or the first drop on their enemy? They are so proactive. What are they doing differently that we're not?
Well, there's a lot of different factors there. And, you know, let me explain the perspective that I bring to this. You know, first of all, I've never been to Israel, surprisingly, after all this time. But, you know, I protected high-ranking members of the Israeli government back in the 90s and early parts of 2000, including Benjamin Netanyahu when he was the former prime minister, and a number of his cabinet. I've also had the privilege, if you will, of protecting some other very interesting characters. One of them in particular was a gentleman named Kamal Salim, who was when he was a child in the Palestinian territories, was raised to be basically a suicide bomber and was raised to be a terrorist. And he left that world and has since been working actively against terrorism. And he's written a number of books, and he brings a very unique perspective to me and to everybody he speaks with about the issues. And you know, when we look at Israel as the sort of ground zero center point of terrorism, it's an interesting perspective because, first of all, I can't forget that it's a much smaller country. It's in some cases the dynamics are much easier to control because of the size compared to the United States and the exposure compared to the United States. But really what we have is kind of a mentality shift. There's a different mentality. And it's relatively important. I mean, it's not relatively, it's critically important for us to understand this mentality. And I'm going to explain it like this. You know, back in 1978, there was a school bus massacre in Israel. You know, we refer to Sandy Hook right now, and Sandy Hook was an incredibly powerful event in this nation, and it has truly changed everyone's psyche that I know of. And in this event in 1978, there were 37 children killed on the school bus, with 76 additionals wounded. All right, and it was a planned and executed jihadist attack. There's no doubt about it. It wasn't some random nut job, as the media likes to look at these workplace and school shooters. And for the record, when I teach about these subjects to schools and to corporations, you know, I don't make a distinction, quite honestly, between school violence or the perpetrators of school violence, workplace violence, and terrorism. It's the same thing. It's the same MO. It's the same objectives, the same methodologies of taking action. And quite honestly, we have to have the same protective measures. So when we look at the paradigm in Israel, they had this incident and it radically changed the perspective in the country. Since then, they've moved on to arming not only volunteers who protect the schools, but also some of the teachers, and having a whole different perspective on the protection that they have in place for their children, as well as nationally. And this is not an argument per se to say we should arm the teachers. That is not in any way what I'm talking about at this moment. I'm talking about the mindset. So when we look at the country right now, a good parallel that we have in the United States would be post 9/11. If we take 9/11 as an example, pre 9/11, Rob, we had a mentality that if someone hijacked a plane, what did you do? You waited and complied and let negotiations occur. And that all changed radically in the course of an hour. And since then, I can pretty much guarantee that we are never going to face another 9/11 style hijacking, because the people in this country, and quite honestly around the world, if it's a passenger jet that gets hijacked or attempted hijack, there's going to be a group of passengers on any of those planes who will be happy to get up and stomp the daylights out of that terrorist. So there's a different mindset now, and the mindset is that we're going to take personal responsibility for our protection.
When you think about those on Flight 93 and what they did, to me, those that were on Flight 93 are true heroes. But do you think that really not just changed that moment in time, but people will look upon that for generations to come when they find themselves, sad to say, it will happen. Obviously, we all hope it doesn't, but in reality, and maybe not on that scale, 9/11, but something will happen again, and someone will reach deep into their soul to conjure up those memories that were told to them by their grandparents or old news footage that will make them know what to do.
I absolutely think you're right. I think that the difference is that, I call it a paradigm shift, because what we have here is literally a pre 9/11, post 9/11 mentality change. And what the mentality change is, Rob, that is really a positive thing, is that more people are willing to understand that personal security, while a fundamental human need, ultimately is an individual responsibility. That's what we're seeing. And I think we're starting to see that with the schools too. There's a couple of things that I usually refer to. First of all, my perspective on close protection is that, and we do close protection operations, as you mentioned, with CSI, Corporate Security Investigations. We do close protection operations all over the globe. And the thing is that it's good to have a lifeguard, but you should know how to swim. That's really what we're talking about. And the thing is that what people don't realize about the necessity for training and preparedness is there's an old quote that goes about 2,000 years ago, a little bit more, by a gentleman named Archilochus, and it's a military maxim. And what it says is basically, we don't rise to the occasion, we fall to the level of our training. So the dynamic here is that it's not just enough to have a mindset change that says, okay, I'm willing to defend myself and my people around me. It has to be something that people take action on, and they seek training, and they look for opportunities for preparedness, and they want to be able to change their ability to react to these situations and respond. I'm going to give you an example. The reason why we started talking about the school stuff is that, most people here in this country do not recall or have never heard of a 2004 incident in Beslan, Russia. Okay, Rob, are you familiar with Beslan?
I am not.
Beslan, Russia is an incident, as far as I'm concerned, that if you want to understand the kind of things we're dealing with from terrorists and what we face as a nation and why it was so important for this war on terror to be prosecuted, you have to look at the incident of Beslan. And I would encourage anyone to pick up a book called Terror at Beslan. And here's the deal. A group of terrorists, about 100 of them. Now, this was a massive scale attack. What they did was they went to Beslan, Russia, where they have a culture there where on the first day of school, everyone has a big festival. And this 100 terrorists, basically with conventional firearms and weapons, herded the entire town as much as they could. Parents, children, siblings, grandparents into the school. Some people fled, but about 1,000 of them ended up stuck in the school. And this drama ensued where they started to wire the school for explosives and make it into a fortress of sorts to resist the authorities' ability to take it back over. And the Russian military and police were completely unable to deal with this situation. They were unprepared, and they basically didn't have any real capabilities of managing it, despite their bravery. And the reality is, I'm not going to explain to the listening audience just the graphic nature of the violence, but we're talking about school children. And when we talk about rape on the level that we're talking about here, it is absolutely unthinkable. And when you herd a bunch of kids into a packed gymnasium and you don't feed them and you don't give them water and it's hot because it's summertime and there's no air conditioning, and you have them in this environment for 3-4 days, and people end up having to suffer through that with no ability to use the bathroom except right there in front of them, and children dying of dehydration. This is the picture that we're dealing with from Beslan.
All right, how do people get a hold of you? Because there is so much more, and we are going to have you back for sure, whether it's with Louie or by yourself, because I find this so fascinating, and being a parent, I want to have the upper hand. What's the best way for people to get a hold of you? I know you have the website and you have the work number, but if they need you now after hearing this interview, what's the best way?
Easiest way to get a hold of me is to call our number, our 888 number, which we get back to everybody. It's 888-433-2040. 888-433-2040. And the website, of course, is livewithconfidence.com.
Will you come back?
Absolutely, Rob.
I hear the passion in your voice. Go ahead.
Let me just make one last comment about this Beslan incident, because I don't want to think of it as something in the mists of time. Long story short, when they finally went to rescue these kids, they blew the place up. About 330 children were murdered.
I remember it.
And the reality here is what Al-Qaeda has promised us is that what has happened in Russia, they owe us tenfold. So I want you to put things into perspective when we're dealing with school security. Sandy Hook, Columbine, Virginia Tech are horrendous atrocities, but they are not atrocities on the scale that a trained terrorist organization will attempt to facilitate in our country. And if we don't figure this out now and prepare ourselves, we're going to be in serious trouble.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome, Rob. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Sam Rosenberg. Again, that number is 888-433-2040.
Hey, it's Ken Rice in the KDKA TV newsroom. This almost isn't fair to hit you with as we struggle through a cold February, but